65 million years ago, dinosaurs fled the Earth to avoid an asteroid crash. 65 million years later, one dinosaur returned, only to discover a planet ruled by humans. And what a mess those humans have made. My name is Artius Zeradar. After pledging years studying the absurdity of the human race, I determined to right the wrongs of this inferior species by exposing its flaws. This is the Artius Zeradar Show. Welcome to the Artius Zeradar Show. My name is Artius Zeradar, and today I'm going to continue from the last conversation we had where we talked about health versus truth. And I'm going to go down a little bit different line, but I first want to address a question I raised. I didn't really explore enough, I don't think, last time. The question of what if Jesse is bad? So is Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad, he claims that he is a bad man. And the psychologist, at least in that show, the therapist, seems to be trying to suggest that, no, you're a good man. Or at least, if you are a bad man, forgive yourself. But yeah, let's consider that. So, if Jesse is a good man but made some mistakes, maybe therapy would be the right answer. Maybe we should seek his health. Maybe he should pursue his health and pursue happiness. But what if he's not a good man? What if he is a bad man? Should the bad man seek his health? Should the bad man pursue happiness? Or should the bad man instead receive retribution in the form of psychological torment? And that is something I just want to address. It seems like a reasonable claim to say that a murderer, someone who has done tremendous evil, instead of receiving the gift of happiness, should receive the punishment of eternal psychological torment. How do we answer that? How do we debate that? Well, we can debate that. You and I can, but not the psychologist. The psychologist would be behaving as you or I. You or me, I think that's right. I would be behaving as you or I would. Sorry, I'm getting caught up in grammar here. Don't worry about that. The psychologist, however, doesn't have anything in the psychological field to provide expertise on the question of whether a bad man ought to pursue health or not health. And that is my ultimate point. I don't know if the bad man should receive retribution. I don't care for the purposes of this conversation. What I care about is, how does the psychologist claim to know that answer? And then, I kind of left this out in the last one too. I said that there are presumptions made, kind of like a paradigm, you could say, or that the psychologist could claim that I pursue health. That's my job. So I don't go into depths or questions about that. Maybe we shouldn't pursue health, but that's not my particular realm. Maybe the psychologist would say that, but that is a problem too, I say. Why? Because if you're starting from that assumption, what if that assumption is wrong? And then what other assumptions are you making? What if those other assumptions are wrong? Well, if the foundation, the first principles of your science are wrong, then your field will naturally pursue what is wrong. Sorry, there's kids shouting in the background. Your field, you will pursue not what is right, but what is wrong. So therefore, these questions do need to be answered. Should you pursue health? Should you pursue truth? The psychologist is not even able to just say, well, let me throw it off to someone else to answer that question. Well, you're making that assumption. And what happens this is even more egregious, is that it gets out into the real world, and the public hears the conclusions of the psychologist, and then they just assume, oh, the psychologist must be right, when they haven't even begun to think about the first principles, whether the principles are right or wrong. So there are consequences to all this. Not only is the psychologist faced with the question of whether or not her pursuit is the correct pursuit, not only is she must she deal with the conundrum of whether or not her answers are right or wrong. After going through all these complex processes and studies and so forth, the conclusion could be totally wrong because the first premises are wrong, and then we give that to the public, and then the public, not having analyzed any of this and really putting a lot of trust into the psychologists and into the field of psychology, assume all this stuff to be true, all this stuff to be right, and then they go off and kind of shape their worldview based off psychology. Moreover, the patients themselves just buy into whatever the psychologist is saying, and the psychologist is not telling the patient, I just want to be clear here, maybe I'm wrong, maybe my first assumptions are wrong, maybe my first principles are wrong, so therefore all these conclusions could be wrong. You don't hear the psychologist saying that. Psychologists don't do that. All of this is egregious. Totally egregious. So I want to kind of change subject here and then kind of come back. There is a presumption of superior knowledge. A presumption of superior knowledge when you walk into that room. And I love it. I mentioned these writers before. I mentioned another writer again, or I don't know the name of the writer, but another TV show. There's a line from The Mentalist, and it's just wonderful. In the very first episode, the mentalist visits a psychologist. He tells the psychologist that he hates psychologists because they always think themselves the smartest person in the room. He's absolutely right. Man, they have some smart writers out there that are clearly contemplating this stuff. I'm very impressed. It's interesting because those writers are, obscure and hidden somewhere behind the names of all these TV shows. We don't even know who they are. The nature of the psychologist's job requires that the psychologist know more than the patient. That's the nature of her job. So psychology deals with thought, right? It's all about what ideas you have. So the idea of psychology is that a patient arrives and has an illness. What kind of illness? An illness of cognition. Thus, an illness of thoughts. So under this view, the patient has the wrong cognitions. And the method of healing is to provide the right cognitions. Most certainly, this must be the nature of psychology. You can't avoid that. In talk therapy, there's no medicine prescribed. There is no surgery. Instead, the psychologist uses her thoughts to fix the patient's thoughts. So if the patient has the wrong cognitions, then the psychologist must have the right cognitions. So there is this presumption of superior knowledge, right? So therefore the mentalist is right to say that the psychologist necessarily believes herself to be the smartest person in the room. To heal the mind, she must know better than the patient. But not only in the field of psychology, think about that. Our thoughts deal with everything in our mind, all of our mind. So the psychologist is claiming superior knowledge not only in her field, she's presuming superior knowledge in all fields, in every realm. I find this so arrogant. But Ironically, though, they must do this if they're to be psychologists. That's what psychology must requires. The only way you could heal the other person by changing their cognitions is that you must have the more intelligent cognitions. To heal the mind, she must know better than the patient. But is it possible to have a patient that is smarter than the psychologist? What if the patient is a logician or a mathematician? I would claim that those are the highest forms of the pursuit of truth is logic and math. So what if the patient has plotted out a system of thoughts founded on an intricate logical deduction? Moreover, what if the patient's pursuit is truth? But imagine that the truth points away from health. Is the patient to switch her premises to align with the premises asserted or suggested by the psychologist? Is the psychologist to assume that she knows better than the logician? Moreover, is this therapy scientific? Is the psychologist conducting scientific experiment? And what about the application of principles? Science only finds the principle. Science cannot apply the principles. The application of principle requires deduction and moreover the assertion of ought. So, having said all these things, I do want to just kind of finalize this discussion with a quick deduction of the day. Today's deduction of the day will be a reductio ad absurdum. So I'm going to start with a given. Let's presume that there is a proposition X, which happens to be a cognition that points away from health. So a true proposition X is a cognition that points away from health. And we're going to just insert that proposition into our minor premise. So the reductio ad absurdum is as follows. Principle. Cognitions that point away from health should be avoided. And that's the premise put forth by the cognitive psychologist. Minor premise. A true proposition X is a cognition that points away from health. Therefore, conclusion, a true proposition X should be avoided. That would be absurd, I would presume. The conclusion that we should avoid a true proposition. And if that's the case, then under the rules of reductio ad absurdum, the principle has been proved false. Cognitions that point away from health should be avoided. That is incorrect. Sometimes they should not be avoided. Yeah. I mean, imagine someone who goes through life avoiding truth for the sake of health. That is what the psychologist would have you do. And I would argue that person is not a free-thinking person either. That's the other thing, is that first you have a psychologist telling you to avoid truth. Second, you have a person who can't think for herself, that needs to have the psychologist tell you what to think. And I mean, the level of therapy is pretty rigorous. So, I mean, what they'll do is they'll send the patient home and have the patient remove thoughts from their mind and then start thinking of these other thoughts. Sounds great, right? I think most people would say that, yeah, it sounds great. I hope that some of you listeners are thinking to yourself, whoa, that doesn't sound great. That you were actively removing thoughts from your mind and engaging in other thoughts. And the reason why you're doing it is because your psychologist encouraged you to do so. I just don't think that's man, it sounds kind of dangerous. And imagine if you have a whole society that does this, a whole society that tries to pursue the psychologist's goal of health, and so tells you to think in a positive way. I argue that that may have already occurred, that it is occurring, that there are large pockets of American society that behaves in this very way. Toxic positivity is what I would call it. I don't like using that word toxic, I guess, because I think it comes from the field of psychology, or at least is something derived from the field of psychology. But I'm using that term against their own practice to some degree. As much as I don't like the term, I kind of do like the term here. Toxic positivity. Man, I've seen it in American society again and again and again. I've been to Europe, and in Europe, I don't think they do that to the same degree that Americans do. Occasionally, you'll see a little bit of it here and there in Europe, but not like in America. Americans have like a nutty obsession with positivity. I've seen that, for example, in the health nuts, the gym weightlifters. I'll see them do a lot of that stuff obsessively. I see it in the church. You go to a church in England, for example, and almost all of them are more conservative. They have so there's a lot of similarities to American churches, but if you look at their youth group programs especially, they still seem kind of, it's just like a nice place to go. But in America, you look at the youth groups in America, you look at some of those super evangelical churches, and there's a level of extremity in their emotional, I guess the level of emotion, and this kind of massive embrace of just flood our mind with positive thoughts. So I've seen it in there. I see it amongst those who are into the crystals and things. What do they call it? Stuff, metaphysics. I not like Aristotelian metaphysics, but I think they call it metaphysics or something like that today. There's another name, I can't think of what the name is, but that group. There's like this, the secret. I mean, that's extreme as it gets. So you have, I think they have, manifestation philosophy or something like that, where you manifest your reality by having positive thoughts. If I think it hard enough, it will manifest itself as reality. I see it in companies. I see it, look at American corporations. Just those of you who have ever worked in an American corporation, I think you'll just notice it. It's just everywhere. This whole life. Don't think in a negative way. Think positive. And if you think negative, you're not one of us. It is in education, American education, the way the teachers present themselves, overly positive all the time. There are other ways to think. The kids don't have to be super positive all the time. It gets to be weird. It starts to feel like Disney World, right? Like I went to Disney World one time for a whole week, and I remember by the end of that week, I thought, man, what is reality? I've forgotten what reality even is. And it's the same thing with American schools. Like, it's so overly positive that, it gets weird. It's everywhere in America. So I think a lot of it comes from psychology. I think the psychologists have had such a profound influence on American society. They've taught Americans to believe this is how you should behave. This is how you should think. And we're the experts. Just obey us. There is a thread that connects to these cognitive psychologists. I'm almost sure of it. It's all the same. It's this: remove your bad cognitions, your negative cognitions, flood your mind with these positive cognitions, and you will find happiness. And you will. You will find a very artificial happiness. Maybe you'll find an authentic happiness. I mean, I'll allow for that, but I would argue, well, I don't think it's the best way to go. I don't think that is, it's just not grounded in truth. And if you're not grounded in truth, I don't care what you got to say. So, anyway.